Everyone. I, Councilmember DeMichelle, call the October 12th Council Study Session to order. Due to the Governor's Proclamation 20-28 relating to the COVID-19 emergency and open public meetings, this meeting will be held entirely remotely. There are multiple public comment opportunities at tonight's meeting. There is a general public comment opportunity at the beginning of the meeting, or you can make comments after the presentation and council question and answer period on tonight's agenda items. I will also ask Council President Hunt to share a summary of any comments that have been emailed regarding tonight's agenda. I will now take roll call of the council members in attendance. Please say here when I call your name. Councilmember Goodman.
Here.
Councilmember Hall.
Here.
Council President Hunt.
Here.
Councilmember Martz.
Here.
Deputy Council President Ray.
Here.
And Councilmember Walsh.
Here.
The first item on the agenda is public comment. If there is anyone on the call now who would like to make public comments but did not sign up to speak, please raise your virtual hand. If you are on the phone, press press *3. If you have joined by computer or smartphone, look for a hand icon. This varies by device. One option may be to go to the participant panel and choose the raise hand icon in the lower right-hand corner. I will wait for a moment to see if anyone wishes to raise their hand. Clerk, has anyone signed up to speak or indicated a desire to speak this evening?
No one signed up in advance to make comments, and I'm monitoring our attendee list now, and I also don't see anyone indicating a desire to speak at this time.
All right, thank you. As a reminder, written comments can be submitted at any time to citycouncil@issaquah.gov. Let's see here. We will now proceed to the first item on the agenda. Just give me a moment here. ID 0960, Performance Measurements Update, and it will be presented by Dale Markey Crimp, Management Analyst.
Thank you, Councilmember DeMichelle. I'm just going to share my screen here. Give me one moment. And let me make sure. Can you all see the slide?
Yes.
Great. Thank you for the thumbs up and the audio as well. It's very helpful. Good evening, members of council. As Councilmember DeMichelle mentioned, my name is Dale Markey Crimp, and I am the fairly new management analyst of performance and budget within the finance department. Thank you for having me here this evening to provide an update on our performance measurement plan. I've been tuning into council meetings and study sessions for the better part of the last 3.5 months as I've been here, but this is my first time speaking directly with you all, and I'm looking forward to our discussion. The purpose of tonight is threefold: to provide an update on our data gathering progress for our citywide measures, to obtain your input and feedback on our current measures and data gathering challenges, and to seek support and input on a programmatic or operational performance measurement pilot that will allow us to better align our day-to-day actions and programs with our city's high-level performance measures. Specifically, my hope is that council can provide answers to the following 2 questions. What revisions, edits, or additions to performance measures should be considered in this upcoming second year? And what 1 to 2 programs, initiatives, or projects, in addition to the 2 I'll mention this evening, are council desired candidates for the programmatic or operational performance measurement pilot in 2022? A little bit of background before we jump in. Prior to my career transition into local government, I worked for over 8 years in program measurement, management, and improvement in both the public education and nonprofit sectors. And I can say there tend to be four main reasons why organizations and teams adopt performance measures. Either to align service delivery to the organization's values and strategic vision or plan, to compare performance against other organizations, in our case, other cities, in the same region of a similar size, or to a nationally established benchmark, to provide transparency and accountability to stakeholders, constituents, and the broader community, and to enable internal staff to set meaningful and measurable goals, to measure progress, and to monitor and adjust strategies to achieve something bigger than just the program in front of them. Here at the city, our current 55 performance measures that were adopted last fall, almost a year ago now. And since then, departments have been working to gather and share both historical and current, as of 2020, data for all 55 measures. When I joined the team in mid-June, I started meeting with all department level staff responsible for enumerating this data from both internal and external sources. This allowed me to get a better sense of our city's current data fitness and to assess our progress tracking and sharing measures. This fall, in addition to working a bit on the budget, I've sought to better understand the broader data landscape within our different departments, the challenges with collecting data on some of our current 55 measures, to learn more about performance measurement programs of other cities, both within and beyond our region, and to ensure that we collect all 2020 data available, even if it's been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. And on this timeline, as we look ahead to 2022, I'm looking forward to working with our IT team to test an interactive dashboard so that the council, the public, and our city staff can see our high-level performance trends over time and compare our performance against both our internal targets as well as potentially some external targets. And partnering with the municipal court and the human services team on some new data collecting tools. The first topic of consideration tonight is the limitations of and the possible edits to our current 55 measures. At this point, we've gathered current, and by current, I mean up to year-end 2020, and historical, where available, data for 85% of the 55 measures. There are still 8 measures for which we do not expect data for 2020. And you can see those here on this slide, along with reasons for the data gaps. Let me walk through each one of them briefly. First off, we have car travel time. As I believe you've heard before, peer cities rely on a company called INRIX for this data. We attempted to go into an agreement with INRIX. However, the city attorney, once looking at that contract, advised against signing it. And so we're currently looking into other options for this measure or how we might measure this in a different way with a different tool. Commute mode share is the next one. And we've made a request to get this information from King County Metro. While we asked about how often people travel by different modes in the community survey, we didn't explicitly ask them about commuting. So that data was really helpful. We know now, for instance, that respondents walk most frequently and regularly, followed by solo car travel. Very few people use van pool. We know all these things from the community survey. However, none of them were explicitly asking about commuting. And so we don't quite have data that matches the measure that we set out and that we defined. Next, we have the percentage of customers surveyed that rate CPD services positively. This was a measure for which we didn't have a tool when it was created in 2020, and staff transition in both my role and the CPD department director role led to a delay in that tool being created. Since then, Minnie Dhaliwal and her team have created that survey. It was created in late August, and we'll start using it later this year, but we won't have data for 2020. For both total jobs and percentage of people who work and live in Issaquah, we will likely have a data gap in 2020. The tool that we've said we'd like to use to measure this and that we've used in the past to measure this is the American Community Survey, or the ACS. And it's sort of a mini census that occurs in the years between the decennial census. However, the federal government has said that due to resource shortfalls and limitations due to COVID, that the 2020 ACS data should be considered experimental. And so they've not yet released it. We are, however, looking into options of working with PSRC to see if they might have data that could work instead. There would just be the question around, do they also have the historical data so that we could track using that same thing over time? And then for the last two here, total hours of racial equity and implicit bias training and the demographic breakdown of our city applicants, employees, and board and commission members. HR did not have historical data on the first measure there, as this is a new initiative, but we will have data for 2021. We just won't have it for 2020. And then for the second one, there were some challenges with NeoGov, the tool that we use, and whether or not we can actually track that data from applicants to employees. And so the HR team has been working on getting that data for 2021, but again, we will not have 2020 data there. So with these in mind, I want to move into the 5 measures about which I've received feedback from department staff who've expressed challenges either in the metric associated with the measure or our ability to get data for this measure, regardless of COVID-related abnormalities. For each of these measures, staff is requesting council input on options moving forward, and department staff recommendations can be seen in the bold font in the far right-hand column here. The first one, which is the number of decisions appealed and lost within CPD. First off, the measure itself, the way that we've defined it previously, was that we were just really actually tracking appeals lost, which will almost always be 0. The second issue that was brought up during my interviews with departments was that the measure itself is not something that the department directly controls. It might be the outcome of someone appealing a decision, but the department itself isn't actually necessarily doing anything that can prevent someone from appealing a decision. In talking with many, the recommendation from the department is to eliminate it as a measure and instead replace it with a more nuanced collection of data under this second measure here, which is the time of first permit review. This is another measure within CPD that's a bit misleading in the way that it's currently tracked. Permits are entered into track it, but only entered as reviewed if the information is all correct. If there are mistakes in that initial permit submission and it's sent back to the submitter for corrections, it still looks as though it's entered the system, but actually that first review doesn't trigger within track it. So this leads to it looking as though it might take 33 weeks for CPD to review a permit, when in reality, it was reviewed within 4 or 5 weeks. It just had to be sent back and then resubmitted and sent back and resubmitted. So they just feel that potentially it's a little bit misleading and it's not as helpful of a measure for them as something that could be a little bit more nuanced. And so their recommendation is to modify this measure with other data and information that is in track it, and that would better align to actually what's required by the state in terms of what we measure. The next measure here, also within CPD, is affordable units and total units built. This is currently just reported in our 55 measures as a whole number. We've built 250 units. We've built 2 affordable units. However, the way that it's reported annually in the housing report card, which is presented to council, is reported by the percent of construction within average median income buckets. And so staff is just recommending that we track data based on that percent average median income category as it's reported in the housing report card, because it's a more transparent and clear communication of the measure itself. 2 more. Car travel time, as previously mentioned, we've been having trouble getting access to a tool that will allow us to get this measure. And the recommendation at this point is to find a new data source. So to work with PSRC and potentially to move away from the ACS or move away from INREX. And then the last one is linear feet of walkways constructed and maintained. In chatting with our public works department, what we found as the main barrier is that the historical data, specifically the data on the number of linear feet of walkway that already exists, has been challenging to determine. what they've recommended is that rather than estimate what's already there and start from an inaccurate number, staff is requesting that moving forward, we just measure newly constructed and maintained rather than a cumulative of all walkways in the city. This will still allow us to benchmark against other cities. It will just be a more truthful and transparent representation of the work that they're doing every year. The second topic of consideration tonight is the piloting of a programmatic or operational performance measurement framework. Our 55 measures are solid, high-level guiding performance measures. They set us up to benchmark our performance and our city health with other cities. They identify significant problems and help us track long-term trends. But they don't currently easily guide programmatic improvements or adjustments that lead to improved outcomes and benefits to the community. And they can often feel like, wow, that's a big thing. That's a big measure to try to move. My proposal, after talking with department representatives, other cities in the region, as well as some consultants from ICMA and other organizations, is to pilot a program-level performance measurement framework. And what this framework seeks to do is to create a link between our high-level 55 performance measures and the everyday work of our staff, by linking the inputs and outputs to these big outcomes and strategic plan goal areas, by setting measurable goals that have monthly or quarterly benchmarks, and by creating a clear theory that connects each of these actions and whose assumptions we can test and can be tested in an ongoing way rather than coming to the end of the year and looking at whether or not this big measure, or even every 2 years, and seeing did this big measure move or not. As you saw in your packet, there are two different, and I would argue complementary ways of approaching linking our 55 measures to the ongoing work of our departments and work groups. The first, which you can see here, is to support teams in developing a program level sort of logic model. This is a very high level example. I'm not getting into the nitty gritty right yet, but these models are asking teams to make visible their theories for how the resources or the inputs and the activities that we are partaking in, how they are leading to program outputs, as well as their beliefs about how those outputs in the middle relate to the short, medium, and long-term outcomes. For example, if we invest a particular number of staff, dollars, and equipment in street maintenance, and we engage in different street maintenance activities such as paving and filling potholes, the outputs we would expect to see in that middle column are a particular number of linear miles paved, a particular number of potholes filled. Those are two measures we already gather information on, so this is a good example to have in front of us. Potentially we'd also want to see a number of neighborhoods that are positively impacted. And then from that outputs, each team or department should have a theory about the outcomes, about how these outputs create outcomes. A short-term impact of filling a pothole may lead to a higher opinion of the public works team from the people who have had to navigate that pothole previously, and now they don't have to anymore, which leads to more trust in government, which leads to a more positive view of our infrastructure and our city services. The second example, which you saw in your packet, is from the city of Kirkland. This is actually an example of how Kirkland presents their performance measures in their budget book. As you can see, this is not necessarily at a programmatic level, but instead it's linking the resources and inputs invested to expected immediate outputs or results to the high-level community outcomes within this goal area. And you can see the City of Kirkland's theory of action that I've been talking about and impact along the left-hand side. They're saying that if we do this, it's going to do this so that this will be true. These are not mutually exclusive frameworks, and while the latter could be used better to organize our measures and determine what data collection gaps we may have in our own citywide strategic theories, the former could be piloted within departments and programs to develop clear connections between daily actions and our 55 measures. As I previewed earlier, I'm already working with the municipal court team and the human services team to use recent survey and customer data to build out program models for community court and hopefully some select human services programs in the coming year. At this point, staff is requesting council input on the strengths and potential of these frameworks to bolster our performance measurement program, and also input on any other programs in addition to community court or in addition to human services that would be good candidates for adopting a programmatic performance measurement framework in 2022. The administration is recommending that the council make minor revisions and accept the revisions to the 5 performance measures for which we've received feedback from departments on the challenges in the measure or the data availability, and support the piloting of a programmatic or operational logic model for some programs in 2022. Dependent on our conversation tonight, I'll be back on November 1st with a few things. Revised performance measures as needed based on our conversation, a comprehensive update with all 2020 and historical data that's been available on all 55 measures, and a work plan for 2022, including a timeline for testing out some interactive data tools and the programmatic pilots mentioned. With that, I will pause my speaking and I'll open it up for discussion, hoping to answer these 2 specific questions. What revisions, edits, or additions to performance measures and their metrics should be considered? What, if any, 1 to 2 additional programs or projects does council recommend as a candidate for a programmatic performance measurement pilot in 2022?
Thank you so much. That was very informative. Do council members have any questions that they'd like to ask? And Dale, I cannot see everybody. Oh, I'm seeing that there is. Councilmember Hall, go ahead.
Thank you. This is Councilmember Hall, and Dale, thank you very much for the thorough presentation. I really appreciate the work that went into this. I think I need a little bit more to wrap my head around the performance measurement framework, because there's a lot there. So, it seems like the origin of this is we have our current set of performance metrics, and at times they may not help inform programmatic level decision making. I was wondering if there was an example that comes to mind of that in particular that could help us understand that a little bit better. Like a very specific performance metric, maybe.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think a really specific example is that there are things that we're gathering information at the output level. We're sort of gathering, I think, potholes that have been filled. We're gathering linear miles paved. And we're also gathering in our biannual community survey, we're asking people how they feel about infrastructure. But I'm not sure it's clear that we have a theory of how those outputs are linking to how people feel about infrastructure. And so my sort of suggestion is that we get a little bit clearer on what is our theory. It's not just a straight line, but we're saying maybe these 2 things alone aren't enough. What are all the things we're doing that's going to lead to movement? So we have the measures. I'm just not sure that we're necessarily always thinking within a framework of how are we going to see progress towards the goals we want to achieve on these high-level measures. Is that helpful?
Thank you. Yeah, this is Councilmember Hall again. I think so. So essentially, it's a way of thinking about a metric and an issue that exists in the community from a really high 50,000 foot level and seeing how everything connects. And in particular, yes. How our performance metrics help us understand kind of the end point, like community feedback and community support of initiatives and programs and et cetera.
Absolutely. And I think the other way that it could work is just anytime we're investing dollars into something new, we want to make sure that we've got a theory about what's the positive impact it's going to lead to. So for instance, if we are going to test if we have a new shuttle coming that's going to connect people, what are we really hoping it does? What are we hoping that people the benefit that people feel from it? And then also, are we measuring to make sure that we're then able to show the community that we've invested in this thing and it's leading to these really good outcomes? Or if it's not, that we're then able to sort of pivot away from that towards something different. But yeah, so it's making those connections more clear.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate the answer.
Thank you. Councilmember Martz, you're next.
Thank you. Is there likely to be a cost or council budget ask associated with this effort?
No. Well, I should not probably just blanket say no, but currently in my understanding and conceptualization of it, no. This is something that we have the resources to do this work and to start thinking in this way, and to sort of move us beyond this initial step. We've got these 55 measures, and now it's really the question of how do we operationalize performance management and improvement? So I don't see that. That's not part of my plan currently.
Let me ask a second question that is maybe a little stickier. How does this not just fall under the purview of what we ask our directors to do?
Yeah, I think it's currently what I've noticed is that we're not always making necessarily the connections to those 55, that the 55 measures, they all exist within the ecosystem, but I've had a lot of conversations where I've gone to get the data, and it's something that's sort of new again for folks. And so I think this is a way of embedding it more completely in the way that everyone's already thinking about their work plans. They're fairly new measures. And so really sort of building momentum and sort of a collective direction towards them.
Thank you.
Thanks. City Administrator Bob Kowitz.
Yes, thank you, Councilmember DiMichele, members of the council. Good evening. Just to follow up on Councilmember Martz's question, these measures are really everyone's measures. And I think one of the challenges that we've had in this last year operationalizing all of these is to really get the buy-in throughout the organization. It can't be just the department director's measures. It can't just be Dale's measures. It can't just be the mayor or the city administrator's measures. It has to be everyone's measures. Because I think that helps stitch together all the work that we're trying to do. And it's not something we can snap our fingers and have change overnight. Certainly in the midst of the pandemic, certainly in the midst of all the changes of priorities that the pandemic has caused us, it's been hard to get folks to focus on this. But I think ultimately, as we come out of the pandemic, as we move the organization forward, it's these measures that kind of string these things together. It helps connect the work that everyone does to move the community forward together. Because I think oftentimes that work becomes very siloed and people don't see how the work that they're doing moves the organization forward. These are very specific ways that everyone helps move the organization forward.
Thank you. Are there any more questions from the council? Seeing none, I'll ask the clerk if there is anyone who wishes to comment on this agenda item.
Councilmember DiMichele, no one signed up in advance to make comments, but let me ask if there's anyone in the audience who would like to comment on this agenda item. Please raise your virtual hand using the small hand icon if you've joined by computer, or by pressing *3 if you've joined by phone. And I'll monitor the sign-up list for just a moment here. Or, I'm sorry, the attendee list. And I don't see anyone indicating a desire to speak.
Thank you. I will next open it up for dialogue from the council. Is anybody willing to make a comment? There we go. Council President Hunt.
Thank you. First, I wanted to mention that we did not receive any email comments that specifically referenced this item. As for my comments, I think that the adjustments that were recommended by the department heads as far as the different changes to some of the metrics sounds very reasonable. I do think it's important that we have a metric that's tracking jobs especially given that we're in a period of economic recovery. And after COVID, I think there's a lot of uncertainty around jobs and what will happen with the jobs market. And I think that's a really important one for us to track. So I understand there's challenges with the previous way that we were tracking that, but in the interim, or if we're unable to get that data again from that original source, I do think that one's an important one for us to continue monitoring. One area where I would like to see an addition to be considered is around homelessness outreach and our park ranger program. These are both programs that were added fairly recently. These were positions that were added fairly recently. And it, I think, would be helpful to track specific metrics that show how this program is going and the benefits to the community that these programs are having. So I would like to add those. And as far as the two different kinds of ways of thinking programmatically about this, I would like to be able to tie it into budgeting. So I think that's important. That will be helpful for us for budgeting. And lastly, as far as the 1 to 2 additional programs, I already mentioned the homelessness outreach and the Parks Ranger program. I think that Monica Negrilla is already tracking metrics and is able to provide those when community members have questions. So just formalizing that into a theory of impact and tracking those and communicating those metrics to the community, I think would be a really strong candidate for this in 2022. And I also think pavement management, which was one of the examples, could be a good candidate, as well as the Green Issaquah program. But the one that I think is probably most important right now is the homelessness outreach and park ranger, because it's a new program and it's of concern to the community. And I do believe we're already tracking things that are of interest to the community. Thank you.
Thank you. The next is Deputy Council President Ray.
Thank you, Councilmember DiMichele. And Dale, thank you for the presentation. It was well done. I agree with Council President Hunt on the changes to the measures. I am fine with that. I am really excited about operational performance measures or programmatic performance measures. And I think tying the outcomes that we're getting to the strategic goals would be really interesting, particularly in your short, medium, and long-term perspectives. If we could, particularly on the long-term ones, look at how they support our strategic goals. I also like, Dale, what you said about using the operational measures on new investments so that we can show the positive impact of new investment or changes in focus. So if we're going to be doing something that's new or different, then we can have some way to show that we're actually making a difference in the quality of life. And I love the notion of having a theory about how this is going to change things. And there are 3 things that I think would be interesting to do a deeper dive into. One is homeless outreach. I agree on that one 100%. I'd also like to see something around mobility. We keep talking about that being one of our top problems, and so something where we can say, hey, we're moving the dial on mobility by doing this or something else. And then finally, something around environmental stewardship, so that we can point to activities we're taking around environmental stewardship and how we're moving the needle there. And then I just have a recommendation for everybody at the city, in fact, anybody who'd listen. And there is a book out there by John Doerr called Measure What Matters. And it talks about how you focus on just a couple of things that really matter to your organization. And then you go about measuring them and tracking results. And it was a template that was used by Google in their early days. And, I think they turned out okay. So there might be some value in that. But anyway, I'm really excited about the renewed interest in measuring, and more importantly than measuring, actually using our measurements to drive performance and behavior. So thank you.
Councilmember Walsh.
Thank you. This is Councilmember Walsh. I have 2 of the proposed kind of elimination or adjustment metrics that I still think have value. So on the CPD set, the time of first permit review, as much as I appreciate that the cause of delay might be because an applicant doesn't provide the right information and there has to be back and forth, I think that still suggests that there's a problem in the system. It may suggest that we're not clear, we don't provide clarity of information on that application step. And so I think it's actually very important to highlight when there are back and forths, because of course, some of those we can't fix. Some of those are actually a feature in the system because it means that our staff is catching something that we wouldn't want built in the community, and so they're pushing back. But in some cases, I think that also means, hey, we didn't ask for the right type of thing. And for it to take 4 or 5 weeks to just get back to somebody and say, yeah, you didn't provide the right information, and then they have to take 4 or 5 weeks to get back to us, and then another 4 or 5 weeks, that to me still represents an area where we could see improvement. And so I wouldn't mind also measuring one of those early points in Track It where, hey, we get back to somebody and see what our speed of response time is. But I still think it's important to understand that full picture in order to try and be more responsive or more clear of information. So that was one. And then on the sidewalks, I kind of find it bad that we don't know the total number of linear feet of already constructed sidewalks. I just feel like that's something we should know. And I think from my perspective, if we're looking at the number of linear feet of sidewalks that are maintained in a year, I'm not going to know whether 5 or 500 feet is the goal metric unless I know what percentage of our total number of sidewalk linear feet is. And so from my perspective, the percent that required maintenance or that were able to be maintained in a year is an important factor that thus requires the total number of linear feet of those sidewalks. So those are the two that I'd still like to be tracked in some way so that we can understand what the bigger picture is on those. And then on the framework idea, I mean, I really like the Kirkland example, and I went back and looked at the other performance measures that they have for things like public safety and everything, and it's fantastic. It creates a clear picture between the amount spent, the outputs of the departments, and then the outcomes. I really like that path, but I do wonder whether that just becomes one of those things that we look at budget time because it provides a pretty picture to the community. I don't know whether the boots on the ground and the day-to-day work is too disconnected from that in order to make it push the needle. I think it would make it adjust the finances, but I don't know if it helps a department or a team have a clear focus on the outcome by creating that type of a framework goal. So if there's a way to fix that, or if I'm wrong about that, great. Because I love the concept of being able to be very clear from dollars to outcomes. I just also want it to be actionable and not just a pretty picture that we look at once a year when we're trying to figure out how much money to spend. So those are my thoughts. Thanks.
Councilmember Martz.
Thank you. So it seems like what the opportunity here is the understanding of the traceability of inputs to outputs and taking a complicated subject and diving into it. So I would love to see our first pilots be on complicated topics. I think travel time through the city, whether you call it car travel time, some metric, I mean, a lot of these metrics were identified by the city after we had identified goals. So I just want to see a strong, I mean, two things. I want to see a strong signal over time that we can carry for a long time and look at over the course of a number of years, but something like average intersection time or average level of service or weighted average level of service, which you would multiply the level of service times the number of cars that use that intersection, something like that, because I think that mobility and gridlock in the city is both an incredibly important topic and also a quite complicated one that would benefit from in-depth analysis. The other thing is I want to sort of second and expand what Councilmember Walsh said. You know, maybe it's not first permit review time, but something having to do with the permitting process. Something, I have to believe that ITMA has some good measures. Wally and his buddies at that August body have to have some good measures for permitting. And I think permitting is another area that is complicated. I mean, I was involved in a, Kanban or whatever, lots of whiteboard drawings around a room, 10 years ago, trying to improve the performance around permitting with the city, and it has resisted our best efforts. So that would be the other area where I think the complexity of the problem would this mapping of inputs to outputs, Kaizen, thank you, Councilmember Ray, would be really beneficial. A big, meaty, complicated problem that has a lot of tendrils and tentacles stretching across departments. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any more comments? Council President Hunt.
Thank you. This is Council President Hunt. A quick follow-up to Councilmember Martz. I think it is a complicated issue around mobility and transit time, the time it takes to get from point A to point B in the city. When we do look at the time to get through intersections, I always want to mention as well that at some point we had a traffic consultant come and talk to us, and they talked about how the perception of safety in the intersection and the perception of somebody who's a pedestrian can be different, especially if you're looking at the moving cars through the intersection. So if you're moving cars through the intersection, then people who are attempting to walk through the intersection might perceive that intersection as working less well. So it is complicated, as Councilmember Martz said, and if we do go with that one, I would want to make sure that we're balancing metrics that represent different modes of travel and the perception of safety, and also the safety of the intersections if we go with that one for the pilot. Thanks.
Any more comments? All right, I will take my turn. Dale, could you put up the slide of the first logic model?
Might you be able to do that? I guess my screen sharing privileges have been revoked.
Oh no.
Yes, I'll do that now.
There we go. Oops. There we go. Thank you. So I really love logic models. We've had to do a lot of work with logic models in influence of choice. The federal government requires that you do a logic model every year for the work that you're doing. And I found that they are really excellent in showing the connections between why you're doing things and the outcomes that you're expecting. And it also helps you identify when your theory is wrong and you need to rethink why you're doing something. So the only suggestion I would have here, I like this one better than the Kirkland one, And at this point, of course, it's very, it's not particular, but I think when you got particular, you will see how it flows from inputs to outputs to outcomes, and it's really good. The only thing, and the logic models that I've worked with on the far left have a statement of the problem that you're trying to solve. And so I put that out as a suggestion so that to me, that ties it all together. Here's what we're trying to do. Here's the inputs that we're doing. Here's the outputs, and here's the desired outcome. I think we just need that little bit of more about why did we start this in the first place? Starting it with the investments we've made sort of beggars the question, why did we choose these to make investments in? And so if we start with what's the problem we're trying to solve or some iteration of that question, I think we'll get a clearer picture of why this flows from left to right and how that all hangs together. So that's my suggestion. And thank you, can take that down now. So I want a +1 or +2 Council President Hunt's idea of tracking our homeless outreach. I think that's an excellent suggestion, and that would be a great metric for us to look at. Depending on the conversation that ensues, I also like the idea of mobility, and Councilmember Mart's suggestion that we tackle something that's more complicated so that we can really see how that programmatic framework actually helps to move the needle forward, because that's really what we want to do. So those are my comments. Are there any additional comments before we wrap this up? All right, I'll just do a little summary of what we said. Pretty much, sorry. Is somebody wanting to say something? Councilmember Hall, sorry.
No worries. I put it in there right as you started to summarize. Real quick, this is Councilmember Hall. I guess I'm still struggling to fully understand the framework. So there've been some discussion about including a mobility metric for the pilot in that one. And then there was discussion about intersection wait times. And I guess I'm confused because I'm not seeing that as a mobility program metric that we have. So are we trying to pick specific metrics that we think would be interesting to pilot and test? Is that what you're looking in terms of feedback, Dale, or are we creating new ones, or am I just not understanding this? Thanks.
I'm happy to hop in here. So the idea wouldn't necessarily be to create any new, for that second thing, we're not creating any new measures, but it's linking those mobility measures. This will be a good test if I'm taking away from the discussion, to linking those high level measures in the sort of outcome section to any output measures we currently already have for mobility, and then working to create a theory that will move some of those high level measures. So improve perceptions of travel time, that will improve car travel time, that will improve our community survey responses on satisfaction with moving in different via different mobility options. And one thing I heard was, we don't want to just say car is king, but making sure that we're hitting the goals for each way of moving. So walking, driving, biking, transit, that we're meeting those goals at each level, but actually giving some theory to that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so then to clarify, this is less about picking a specific performance metric and testing it in this framework. It's more about several performance metrics in a specific category.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay. Thank you.
Councilmember Martz.
I think that I think multimodal transportation is important, but I think when our constituents write us letters about how unhappy they are, they're unhappy about their ability to drive through the city. They're not saying, by and large, with a couple of notable exceptions like South Cove, they're not saying they can't get places on foot. They're saying they can't get places in their cars in a reasonable amount of time. So I think there's two separate questions, which is, one is how are we doing on multimodal, and there's all sorts of metrics you can have associated with that. But 99.9% of the mobility related feedback that we get in the city is about the blistering traffic that we have. And I don't think we should kid ourselves that it's otherwise. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Martz. Any additional comments? All right, well, we had a lot of comments, so I'll do the best I can. So we heard generally that with some exceptions, that the suggestions for changes are good, and I'll go over those suggested differences, but suggested ideas for additions to metrics would be the homelessness outreach program, pavement management program, the Green Issaquah program, again, homelessness outreach, mobility, environmental stewardship, and homelessness and mobility. Those were all ideas for additions to the metrics that we're looking at. We had at least two council members who said that we should continue measuring the community planning department's the amount of time that it takes to get a permit through, and also a wish that we would know how many linear feet of sidewalks we have in the city of Issaquah. And because otherwise we would not be able to understand how much progress we're making. And we had a book recommendation from Councilmember Ray, Measure What Matters. And we had a plea from Councilmember Martz to take on something big and meaty and complicated. So is there any addition to that summary? All right. Thank you very much, everybody. We will go on to the next item on our agenda. Dale, thank you for a very excellent presentation. All right, the next item on the agenda is ID 0924, proposed 2022 budget deliberations, and it's presented by Autumn Monahan, interim finance director, and Susie Munsell, acting budget manager.
Thank you, Councilmember DiMichele and members of the City Council. Tonight is Council's first deliberation on the 2022 budget. And Susie's going to help me by sharing slides. So tonight, following some presentations on a few topics, we'll start with the following policy questions for the City Council. First is police roles and staffing. Are they proposed at the right levels? Human services roles and staffing, are they also proposed at the right levels? How should we use the one-time investment fund? And should the council approve or approach allocation of ARPA spending in this budget, as well as any other council feedback? As a quick reminder, our budget schedule is moving along. Tonight is the council's first deliberations, and second meeting is set for October 26th to continue deliberations. And final adoption of the proposed budget is slated for November 15th. And so to start off, I'd now like to invite Chief Beerbaum and his team to present on police roles and staffing levels outlined in our proposed budget.
Thank you. Thank you, City Council. My name is Scott Beerbaum, Chief of Police for the Issaquah Police Department. I'm here to talk to you about our planned 2022 budgeting and talk a little bit about staffing levels. Can I have the next slide, please? In the 2022 proposed budget, we have asked for additional three sworn positions, one sergeant, one corporal, and one police officer. In addition to that, we have also asked for one civilian position, a crime prevention analyst. To go deeper into that, the intent of the addition of these positions is to refocus resources to address some of our traffic and community needs. As people are returning to office, we are seeing an increase of traffic within our community. We're starting to see a return of traffic collisions and a request from our community for additional traffic enforcement. Additionally, as people are returning and we are partnering with human services, we definitely see the need for having staff to be able to partner with human services to respond to homeless outreach, respond to people in crisis, and to really connect those within our community that are in need of services. Additionally, as part of our 2022 proposed budget, we are really looking at realignment of resources to address emerging needs. What we have found that our prototypical model has not been as nimble as we would like to address some of our emerging needs. Yes, we are still going to be committed to the 24/7 coverage of community safety, but we definitely have a need to address resources to address items such as earlier in this year, we had storage unit thefts that required our police officers to kind of refocus their attention to those locations. But yet we still have to respond to emergent calls for service from the community. As part of the 2022 proposed budget, we are going to create a special enforcement team that allows us to address those emerging needs. And where there is, along with traffic as associated with school issues, summertime issues, as we head into the holidays coming up, we typically see increase of package thefts or increase of vehicle prowls in the shopping districts, and we want to be able to assign resources to address those type of needs within our community. Now, in addition, the civilian positions, the crime prevention analyst, really is to back up and help our investigators who are following up on some of these crimes. With changes in legislation, our ability to react in the moment has changed slightly, and so we're having to do a lot more follow-up on crimes that have occurred within our city. We have to follow up on leads outside of the city to include following up on suspects utilizing stolen credit cards, stolen items outside of the city at other stores, community locations, etc. The intent of the crime prevention analyst is to really free up some of the resources of our sworn positions and to do that the force multiplier. In addition, the council has already approved the limited term employment police communications coordinator. It's going to be continued into 2022 as part of our budget as well. That focus again is to really help with the recruitment, retention, and helping with the communication within our department to the community. Next slide, please. This is the 2022 proposed org chart, and really this is going to lay out where some of these positions are going to be applied. With the addition of those positions, we will be standing up another squad supervised by that sergeant, the Traffic and Community Services Sergeant. We will also have a corporal standard to what our other patrol squads and our investigations unit has to have that backup supervision to address these different issues. We will still have traffic officers. We will have the CRO is the Community Resource Officer. That is, again, to work alongside with our behavioral health coordinator and our homeless outreach to really partner and to be able to share information and assist them. Whereas some of our patrol officers may be responding to emergent calls for service, the CRO really could be working hand in hand with that behavioral health coordinator. Additionally, the special enforcement officers, again, adds that ability to be adaptable to kind of our community needs. And then the station officer is a position that we really have leveraged with our increase of online reporting and a lot of our community members simply calling to report information. The station officer has been able to take an immense amount of workload from the patrol officers and to be able to free them up to work within the neighborhoods to focus on different issues that are occurring within the city. And then again, I'd like to focus on the far right-hand side of the screen for the police communications coordinator. That is the new LTE. At this point, I failed to introduce, but I would like to also introduce Commander Paula Schwann, I believe she is on, and then Commander Lauren Truscott. Commander Paula Schwann is in charge currently of our Patrol and Investigations Division, and then Commander Truscott is in charge of our Jail and Dispatch as well. So I know that was a brief overview, but if you have any questions, we are here to answer those.
Deputy Council President Ray.
Thank you, Councilmember DeMichelle. This is Chris Ray. I think I know the answer to this question, but the positions that are denoted with an asterisk at the end, those represent the ones that are new in this budget cycle, net new ads?
Those are new positions, correct. In the blue section of the sergeant for the traffic community services sergeant, the corporal traffic, and then the one special enforcement officer, those would be new FTEs, correct. And then the other asterisks, the police communications coordinator is a continuity of what's agreed. And then we actually have also asked for the continued increase of the record specialist that had been increased to a full FTE earlier this year.
And then a follow on. So we're creating this new traffic and community services patrol, which is cool. So most of those, the station officer and one of the special enforcement positions, the CRO and the traffic officer, those are existing headcounts that are in the current budget. Is that
correct?
Reading that right too? Okay.
Yes, correct. They are currently within the budget.
Okay. Great. Thanks, Scott.
Councilmember Walsh.
Thank you. This is Councilmember Walsh. Further on kind of that concept, when I'm looking at our current 2021 org chart, I see one detective corporal and one detective, and then within that squad, 2 CROs and an SRO, whereas in this I'm seeing 3 detectives. So can you walk me through what those adjustments look like?
Absolutely. So in 2020, we had to move resources around due to some of our COVID response. As a result, we moved more of our resources back to patrol and out of detective. So in 2019, we actually had additional resources within the detective division. And then as we moved to 2020, we had removed some of them for the 2020 budget, our 2021 budget process. I apologize, I'm using too many numbers. The 2021 budget process, we had to move some of our FTEs out of those different specialty positions and really focus on patrol. So what we are doing is realigning those resources. Yes, we had 2 CROs and 1 SRO, and we're realigning those resources to better address what our anticipated needs are for 2022. The community resource officer position, we feel that if we have 1 point leading that connection to the behavioral health coordinator, then that will be able to help disseminate information onto the patrol squads as well. They do still work hand in hand with them, but the CRO will be kind of that point for that piece. Obviously, over the last year, the conversations with the school district and the school resource officer, we are still working with the schools to make sure that there is safe community. But they are still in the process of examining how they want to manage safety within the schools. And then lastly, yes, the 2 positions, the special enforcement positions, those are just reallocation of some of our past resources.
Okay, so if I get you correctly, the number of detectives that you have in the proposed 2022 org chart isn't the same as 2021 because of COVID reductions and staffing reallocations to patrol, but it is more similar to what we were doing before in 2020 or 2019.
Correct. And we are also anticipating what we've learned over the last few months regarding some of the legislative changes, how we investigate and how we're going to follow up on crimes have definitely changed, and we want to make sure we can still investigate and recover property and to be able to charge those responsible for the crimes that occur within our community.
Okay, I have a few more questions on this. So if 2021 represented having to move some of those detectives out into patrol because there were openings, if we still have those openings, which of these positions, whether detective or the traffic and community services, would you anticipate slotting into patrol needs, or what is the plan in that concept?
Absolutely. Our priority is patrol response. That is the 24/7 coverage for 911 calls and emergent life safety issues. So we will staff patrol first. Then it is a balance of investigations. We will have to keep detectives staffed because we do need to do that follow-up that often leads us outside the city. And then our community resource, our special enforcement, those positions are the ones that will be the same ones that would be left vacant. Again, focusing more on our 24/7 initial response to emergencies. And throughout the last year, we have had to move some of our personnel around depending upon some of the needs that we've had in the community over the past year.
Okay. I would anticipate, just because of the positions and the needs of those roles, that the detective positions and the traffic and community services positions, are those more 9 to 5 daytime type positions, whereas our 4 squadrons have to cycle through day and night. So is there an anticipation that somebody might be hired for a daytime type position but have to slot in to a switching schedule?
So we have examined opportunities to be able to bring in personnel in different positions. We obviously want to honor and recognize the employees, our officers that are currently with us, and provide them those opportunities. As our new employees become online, then they would be assigned to patrol. And normally they would be assigned to patrol. There is always a possibility that we could bring somebody in one of those roles, but they would have to serve in the patrol first after a certain period of time, and then transition to those positions. Now, the detectives typically are more of like your Monday through Friday hours. They are typically spread throughout the day to kind of, again, provide additional resources that we can tap into in case of emergency. But they definitely do a lot of the follow-up because they are following up with like bank institutions or other entities that typically have that more Monday through Friday 9 to 5 hours. Now, additionally, though, our traffic and our CRO and special enforcement, those hours are going to vary. Our intent is to make sure that they're spread out a little bit more over the day and throughout the week as well. Traffic typically, is an issue between 6 a.m. until late in the evening, and it's also on the weekends. So we want to make sure that those resources are available. And we have historically, when traffic officers or CROs or anyone else, they do respond if we do have an emergency and resources are limited. But our intent is to spread them out throughout the week and over the day as well.
Thank you, Chief Beerbaum. I appreciate the thoughtful responses and the picture of this. Appreciate it.
All right, is there anybody else have questions at this time? I am not seeing any, so Chief Beerbaum and Autumn, please proceed.
Great, thank you. Next up is Monica Negrilla, our Human Services Manager, to present on human services roles and staffing levels.
Thank you so much, Autumn. Good evening, council members. This is Monica Negrilla, Human Services. So tonight I was asked to provide a brief summary of the current human services roles and staffing levels, which are a direct result of last year's budget process, but also to discuss this year's proposal to add a behavioral health coordinator position, the equivalent of one full-time position in the 2022 budget process. So just a brief overview of the current human services roles and staffing levels. If you may recall, in 2021, at the beginning of this year, the human services functions in our city grew from 1 FTE human services coordinator position to what now we have a human services division. And that is comprised by 1 FTE for a human services coordinator position, and that's Hannah. Hannah Roberts is also with us here tonight. Thank you, Hannah, for being here. We also have added a full-time behavioral health coordinator, and that is Amir Shabana. He could not be here tonight. They recently welcomed, he and his wife recently welcomed a baby girl. So he's on paternity leave, but he is returning next week. Also, the Human Services Division has a 10, 15-hour-a-week PTNR part-time non-regular position in a human services assistant, and that is Marisol Visser. And also a full-time human services manager, and that's me. So just a brief overview in terms of roles. The human services coordinator, which, as I mentioned, Hannah is here with us tonight. She administers and manages the grants that we provide to 57 different nonprofit programs. She and I also tag team on local and regional coordination. Hannah's been leading the efforts on the community engagement for our community needs assessment and has a key role on the human services strategic planning that we are working on currently. Hannah's been also helping the municipal court, in particular our court administrator, Christy Shorn, with community court tasks, and she is in training currently to provide some assistance with case coordination for the Community Resource Center. So Hannah will take on those tasks at the end of this month. She also helps coordinate with me the brand new internship program that we started with Lake Washington Tech, with the behavioral health program there. We are assisting with professional development, and so it's a great partnership that we are looking forward to grow. And then also Hannah's in training and will transition soon to becoming the liaison to the Human Services Commission. So I think that's a brief summary of Hannah's position. Again, I'm very, very grateful to have her with us tonight, but also to have her as part of our team. On to the behavioral health coordinator position. So just a quick note, Hannah's position was part of the 2021 budget, and she was hired back in April. Also in April, we hired the behavioral health coordinator position, and that was Amir. And so, as you also heard from Chief Birbaum earlier, Amir's primary role was to really work with our police department in referral coordination. That is a new program that we started and launched in June. But in addition to that, Amir has been taking on really a more intensive role in homeless outreach, as we've been working in supplementing the contract position that we had, and I'm going to talk about that in just a few minutes. And then also Amir's been working on interdepartmental behavioral health and outreach coordination, as we've been receiving referrals for that program from different departments and from the community as well. Currently, since we launched the program, we received 57 referrals for that program. And so I'm happy to answer any more questions and talk a little bit about that in just a few minutes. And just moving on, just to give you a brief summary of the next position, our part-time non-regular position, and that is held currently by Marisol Visser. She has been working on language access and volunteer coordination. Earlier this year, she had a lead role in the outreach for vaccinations to different cultures. She's been providing a cultural lens and translations and interpretations. She's been coordinating a group of volunteers that assist with translations, especially our nonprofit partners, for example, Issaquah Community Services that provides rental assistance through the work of Marisol and the volunteers. We have they were able to provide now rental assistance forms in different languages, which increased capacity and access to multiple new residents. And then also Marisol has been helping with cultural conversation series. I know that some of you have been participating in those. We launched those earlier this year, and we had held a few of those, one for Juneteenth, Pride Month, and so forth. And so I think that concludes an overview of our team's roles. In addition, as a manager, in addition to supporting the team, I also help coordinate the homelessness response, and then also help with setting up the new equity board, and I'm humbly serving as a staff liaison to that. And so thank you, Tisha, for helping with that. We can go to the next slide now. In terms of the 2022 budget proposal, we are hoping to propose a new full-time equivalent and a new behavioral health coordinator position. And the goal for our proposal would be to expand the current program. This will allow us to expand services and assistance from 5 days a week, 8-hour position to a 7-day per week service coverage, which will also expand from 8 hours a day to 10 hours a day, and then provide really a 7-day coverage. This will not be a 24/7 program, but it will provide weekend and so also extended days. The second goal with this proposal is for us to reallocate the pilot outreach program. And this will be transitioning the program from a provider contracted position to an internal city position. And third, we would love to combine and propose combining the behavioral health and homeless outreach programs. The reasoning behind this proposal is really we learned quite a few lessons as in the last few months as we launched different programs. So as you may recall, the first behavioral health program coordinator position was created during the 2021 budget process, and this was part of last year's budget. And it is a result of a collaboration between the police department and the Human Services Division, really with the goal of providing long-term support and service connection to high utilizers of police services who experience recurring behavioral health crisis. And so the program that was created, as I mentioned earlier, currently serves a little bit over 50 individuals. And we learned that often folks with behavioral health crisis are also homeless, or the folks that we see in the homeless outreach program also have a behavioral health need. So on one end, there is an overlap, but also we learned a few lessons from the pilot homeless outreach program. Currently, that program in a pilot form is a contracted position with the Issaquah Food and Clothing Bank, and the pilot is set to end at the end of this year. And so we believe that this is an opportunity for us to really combine the two programs, especially as there is overlap. And then with the two programs, we can then provide extended day services and the 7-day coverage. So it's really an opportunity to leverage resources, and it's more of a reallocation of a position than necessarily the creation of a new position. So with that, I'm going to pause because I feel like I talked quite a bit in case there are questions or comments, and if there's interest in us explaining a little bit more the reasoning behind this.
Thank you, Monica. Does anyone on the council have a question? Deputy Council President Ray.
Thank you, Councilmember DiMichele. This is Chris Ray. Good evening, Monica. Thanks for all of the good information. Can you talk a little bit more about what we learned from particularly the behavioral health pilot and kind of why why we want to move away from contracting that out and bringing that in-house? What were some of the drivers for that?
Yes, absolutely. Hello, and thank you so much, Deputy Council President Ray. So yes, one of the biggest lessons that we learned is that our community and our community at large and our homeless population in particular needs us to have the ability to respond in a very short period of time. And that means sometimes in terms of hours or even a half an hour or minutes. And when we have a contracted position, by the time communication is shared of our, let's say if we need to conduct outreach to a homeless individual on Gilman and Front Street, nonprofit agencies don't often have the capacity to respond immediately. And so perhaps they are going to have time to come in 3 days or perhaps the next day. And so that leaves us, in difficulties responding to the needs. So I think that's one of the areas, I think, one reason by bringing the position internally gives us more control over when we respond and how we respond. But in addition to that, I think we learned quite a few other lessons. As I mentioned, there is overlap between the calls that our police department gets in terms of crisis and behavioral health crisis. Really, many times folks are homeless, or when we do conduct outreach, we do notice that there's a behavioral health component and further assistance is needed. So there's just an opportunity to leverage resources.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Any further questions from the council? I'm not seeing any, but I do have a question. When you talk about expanding and adding extended days and 7-day week services, can you tell me, have we discovered that there's a need in the middle of the night, for example? Is there a need, obviously on Saturdays and Sundays? Yes, so I'm presuming that when we hire this new person, that there'll be 2 of them and they'll overlap and then be able to respond for a much wider period of time.
Yes, thank you. So the intent is, like you said, let's say we have 2 positions. They're going to each work 10 hours a week. So each will work for 10 hours, 4 days for 10 hours. So that will provide for extended coverage. We did notice, I think often there is a need for evening hours. So we are talking and we started adjusting perhaps shifts to start perhaps either at noon or at 10 a.m. So start later in the day. So we have some coverage in the evenings. Of course, every once in a while, there is a need for overnight response, but at the same time, based on our communications and conversations with police and based on our resources, I don't believe that at this point, our community needs, let's say, a 24/7 response. I think the evening or overnight, late evenings or overnight calls just do not warrant another full-time position, or even if we think 24/7, coverage would not mean just adding, let's say, a 3rd staff, would really mean adding a total of 6 staff, which I don't think that is what our community needs at this time. I think as we learn more and how we develop, we can reconsider, but so yes, but like you said, I think definitely a need for weekend hours. And so I think we would like to try for 2021 to just provide a 7-day coverage, 10 hours a day, and see kind of like if that really fully meets the needs in the community.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. Are there any further questions from the council? All right, Autumn, I'll let you move ahead.
Great, thank you, Councilmember DiMichele. So next up is the one-time investment fund. Mayor Pauly has also designated $1.25 million in the proposed budget as a one-time investment fund. Options for this funding are varied, and here are a few that we've put up for some consideration. The first is not allocating these funds, meaning that our undesignated fund balance would increase from 19 to 21%. Another is to add these funds to future ARPA programs, which we'll discuss here in a moment. We could also hold for open space or land acquisition needs, or also hold for city hall or city facility needs in the future. And then any other city council priorities. Of note, these funds could also be saved to help support future recommendations of the Capital Finance Community Task Force. And lastly, I wanted to briefly cover ARPA, our American Rescue Plan Act funds. So we're anticipating receiving more than 11 million in federal funds. Half was received in this year and the other half will be received in 2022. These funds must be obligated by the end of 2024 and expended by the end of 2026. As a starting place, the city council or the city focused on addressing any immediate or urgent community needs. And so we estimate we'll spend about $100,000 this year on staff time for our recovery coordinator position, as well as reopening costs due to COVID precautions at City Hall, and assistance in reviewing our grant management practices internally to ensure that we're meeting all the extensive federal requirements that come with ARPA. In addition, next week on October 18th, the City Council is also scheduled to hear proposals for spending $600,000 in ARPA funds on two immediate needs and programs: the Small Business Flex Fund and the rental assistance, another rental assistance program for community members. We're also assessing if there are other needs among other Issaquah government agencies performing essential work during the pandemic, so more to come on that as well. So that's kind of the first bucket. The second is, following those immediate needs come decisions on longer term investments for our community. The 2022 proposed budget includes spending $1.25 million in capital project design for two projects: Newport from SR 900 to Southeast 54th and Northwest Sammamish Road non-motorized improvements. And moving forward, we look forward to continued community engagement next year around the balance of these ARPA funds. And then just quickly, as far as next steps, a reminder on our budget schedule. The next deliberations is scheduled for October 26th, and our list of draft items for those for that study session as far as topics include an updated revenue forecast from our budget team, more details on our ending fund balance and how we got here. We've received several questions about that from city council members. How we should approach funds hardest hit by the pandemic. One that's come up has been our arts fund. How to approach CPDs in the future, and then a proposed true up of our fleet fund. So to circle back to the policy questions for tonight, this includes police roles and staffing, the human services roles and staffing, use of the one-time investment fund, and then our approach for ARPA allocation. And so that we're here to answer any questions.
I am not seeing any. There's one. Councilmember Hall.
Thank you. This is Councilmember Hall. Thank you. I have a quick question on the one-time investment fund, and I actually asked this question via email earlier today, but I want to make sure everyone on council has the opportunity to hear the answer before we go into the comments as well. But I had asked City Administrator Bobkowitz, and he gave me a good answer, so perhaps he could give the same answer to the group. But I was curious if it would be possible to use one-time investment fund monies on hazard pay in the form of a one-time payment for frontline city employees. And then actually a question on top of that I didn't ask in the email that Wally or if anyone else can answer is this something that we can do through the regular budgeting process, or would this need to be bargained in some way if that was something City Council elected to do?
Councilmember Hall, members of the council, as far as a one-time money for staff, that is something the administration has also been thinking about as we are ending the year. Certainly our staff, especially the staff members who have come to work every day since March of 2020 through the pandemic, we think there may be an opportunity for some sort of hazard pay, one-time payment for those employees. The city of Seattle is doing that with a number of their bargaining units this fiscal year at an amount of $1,750 per employee. We would probably propose rounding it up to maybe just an even $2,000 for those employees that have come back who have come to work every day, who have not had the ability to work at home. So that is certainly something, if the council is interested, we could do some additional work over the next week and either come back next week on the 18th or come back on the 26th with further discussion about that. As far as our ability to make those payments, we're still speaking with the city attorney about that. Some communities are using ARPA funds for that, but as our finance staff is talking with experts who are having a better understanding of ARPA, that may not be the best funding source for that. So general fund balance might be easier and simpler for that. As Autumn mentioned in her review of ARPA funding, there's also a discussion that we had brought to the council several months ago about supporting other Issaquah public agencies which did not receive ARPA funding, two specifically, Eastside Fire and Rescue and the Sammamish Plateau Water District. So that would also, I think, come up as part of the discussion on ARPA next week. So we'd be happy with the council's direction to look at the payments for staff who have worked through the pandemic, and then be prepared to talk about funding source ARPA or the general fund.
Thank you. Are there any further questions? Seeing none, I will ask the city clerk if there is anyone wishing to make public comment on this agenda item.
Councilmember DiMichele, no one has signed up in advance, but there are a few members of the public attending the meeting. So if anyone would like to make comments, please raise your virtual hand by selecting the hand icon, or if you've called in by phone, please press *3. And I'll just monitor this list for a moment. And I'm not seeing that anyone wishes to make comments at this time.
All right, thank you. Then this is the time for council to take on these 4 questions. I wonder if we could just take the questions down for just a moment so I can see everybody. Here we go. Thank you. As the presiding officer tonight, I'm going to suggest that possibly we do a thumbs up and thumbs down on the first 2 questions. If anyone has an objection to that, let me know right now so that if that's not the direction you like, this is your meeting, not mine, but that's my suggestion for the first 2 questions. I'm not seeing, Council President Hunt.
Thank you. And I also see that Councilmember Martz has a question. I actually had a question from before, so if that's okay. I had a follow-up question on the hazard pay, and the question is around so it was mentioned that it might be around $2,000 per employee, but I'm wondering about the total approximate amount just for our consideration, and if that's something that would have to come back to council, that's also fine, but I'm wondering about what we would estimate the total amount would be at that rate.
And we can do that review, Council President Hunt, as we review those that have needed to report to work.
Okay, so we don't have an estimate. Okay.
I'll take another step further than that. You know, it's probably about 100. As Autumn has mentioned, though, we want to go through each classification and make sure, because it's not just Public Works, Police, Parks. It's Tim, who's had to come in every night. The council has met while you've been virtual. He's been at City Hall connecting things together. So that's someone who's come. Our IT staff who have come in. So there are lots of folks that aren't necessarily out on the street in a vehicle, but have still had to come in. So we want to be thoughtful to go through each and every classification. But I'll say 100, and so that would be $200,000. But we will work on, if this is something the council is interested in pursuing, we'll scrub that down further over the next week or 2.
Thank you, City
Oh.
Administrator Bobquist. And I do see that Councilmember Martz also has a question.
Yes, Councilmember Martz.
Thank you, Councilmember DeMichelle. This is Councilmember Martz. I just have a process question. What does thumbs up mean and what does thumbs down mean?
Oh, that's a very good question. I would say that if you put your thumbs up, you think that the staffing and the roles that are proposed are acceptable to you. And if you put your thumbs down, then I would say we would have a further discussion.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Any other comments? On question number 1, do we agree that the police roles and staffing are appropriate? Thumbs up or thumbs down? All right, I'm seeing a unanimous consensus there. And then on the second question, are the human services role and staffing as proposed appropriate? Thumbs up or thumbs down? All right, thank you very, very much. So we'll go on to the next question, which I imagine will have more input from the council. How would you like to use the one-time investment fund? And I will look for people who want to make comments. Let's see. Lots of comments. All right. I believe Deputy Council President Ray is first, if I'm correct there.
Looks like it to me.
Okay.
Thank you, Councilmember DeMichelle. This is Chris Ray. My comment on this is fairly straightforward. I would like us to take this investment fund and invest it in something that will actually reduce the cost of providing government services in the future. So to truly invest it in ourselves to make the city a more efficient, effective, or operationally smoother organization, so that we can recognize that we are going to have budget problems in the future. So if we can invest this money so that we can reduce the cost of delivering services, then I think that is probably the best use of that money in the short term.
Thank you. Councilmember Walsh, I believe you are next.
Thank you. This is Councilmember Walsh. So I think from my perspective, the first thing I would like to say is I want us to spend this in the budget and to have it as a consideration in the budget and not just earmark money like we did last year. So I think that's the first question for me is, are we setting this aside so that council can make a consideration for what needs are 6 months, 8 months down the road? I'd say no to that. I think we were pretty clear in last year's budget that we don't want to just set money aside just to hit the financial policy of 20%. Second to that, I think it's really difficult as a council to sit here and look at a pile of money and try and understand what project needs there are that meet that bucket of funds. So if I was to look at it, I would go back to our strategic plan, or I would go back to the community survey. And a lot of those things require way more than 1.25 million. So I would appreciate any feedback from the administration if there are any projects that meet that criteria. I think I would be interested in sticking to what the community has said is their priority as a first plan. That being said, I very much appreciate what Councilmember Hall has come up with here as a creative idea to show the appreciation for our frontline workers and our employees who have been here on the streets and in person for this long period of time. And I think that's a very valuable way of, maybe it doesn't reduce the costs of doing business necessarily, but it certainly could keep a number of employees happier in their current positions, which would keep us from having to hire and train new employees. So I think it somewhat meets that same criteria as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Hall.
Thank you. This is Councilmember Hall. I had three different things I wanted. Oh, actually, first, Councilmember DiMichele, let me say that was a very efficient way of getting through the first two questions. So that was great. Nicely done. I had three things that I thought we should consider adding to the list of things to potentially spend these monies on. The first was actually in line with what Councilmember Walsh just said, which was, trying to better understand feedback from administration about what we could do with regard to strategic plan projects to actually move the dial or set up dedicated fund for specific projects that we know, projects or initiatives that we know there's already community buy-in on. So I guess that would be my first feedback. And then also I would like to suggest that we consider using those one-time investment fund monies on hazard pay for one-time payments for frontline city employees. I mean, it's been said before already by other people today, but these are the people who've been showing up for work in person day after day, even before we had a good understanding of what the pandemic was, before vaccines were here. These are the people who haven't had the opportunity or the option to work from home in the first place either. So I think that this would be an interesting consideration of council to honor that commitment from frontline city employees, but also acknowledge that risk. So I'll just put that out there that I think that should be high up there on our list of potentially considering that as a council. And then third, I didn't see anything either about potentially paying down debt or supporting future debt capacity. And I think that that should be on the list as well as a potential action with these funds. So thanks.
Thank you, Councilmember Hall. Council President Hunt.
Thank you, Ms. Council President Hunt. I appreciate the suggestion around the hazard pay. I think that is a good one for us to get a better sense of the amount. It's, using the number that was today, that would be 200,000 approximately, ballpark estimate. So that would, I think, be a good thing for council to get a little bit more information about how that would work, but I do think it's definitely worth exploring. For the remaining $1 million, I was looking through our strategic plan, and one thing that has stood out to me with this budget is that we have 4% towards the environmental stewardship part of the strategic plan in this budget. If you look at that 4%, it does include things like pavement management and administrative parks staffing fees, which arguably I would say are not specific to some of the actions that are in the environmental stewardship part of our strategic plan. And the environmental stewardship is very important to our community. So I would argue that we should consider the open space. It's putting this aside in an open space fund. There's a couple reasons. I think the biggest one is that open space is for everyone. I think the natural areas are a sort of connective tissue for the community, and they can be a unifying force. People move here and love being here because of our open space and natural areas. So I think it's important that we continue to maintain those areas, and that we also continue to follow through on some of the promises and plans that we've made, like the creek corridor and acquisition of lands along the creek corridor so that you can walk along there. So that's the big one for me, is that open space is for everyone. I think this is an opportunity that we could put aside this one-time funds for that. As far as it being something that we could meaningfully move the dial in the strategic plan, I agree with Councilmember Walsh, and I was specifically thinking about it from the perspective of there are so many projects in our capital improvements program, and a lot of them are a lot bigger than 1 million. This is a meaningful amount, and an amount that would move the dial and would help us achieve our stated goal in the strategic plan as far as having dedicated funds for open space acquisition. I I believe that Director Watling is here and can probably speak to that, but I sent in some emails in advance with questions on this, and I think it's a meaningful amount to get that fund, and it would help us leverage grants, which is really important. So it's a good, I think, financial investment in that way, and it would also help us to be better, to be more agile when opportunities come up. And again, we already said this was one of the actions we could do in our strategic plan, so I think we should follow through on that when we have the opportunity. And then I believe that we still have funds set aside for the City Hall planning, which is one of the reasons why I do not gravitate towards that. I believe that we have approximately $5 million in mitigation funds that we still are keeping for that. And right now, with remote work and with so many potential changes about the future of work and space needs and moving out of City Hall Northwest, I think that it's great that we have that set aside, but I do not support using this for City Hall City Hall funds, the $1 million. Yeah, and then lastly, I think it's really important that we try in good faith to meet our financial policy every budget cycle, and we do consistently come in above the target range for our reserves. We are, with spending this, we would still be at 19. Usually we do come in a little bit above the estimate because we have conservative estimates. So I would strongly urge us to spend this because we do have needs. We have things that we've said we would do in our strategic plan over 5 years. We're more than halfway through now. So I think we should spend it for the benefit of the community. And my feeling is that we have made commitments in this open space acquisition area, and land is not going to get less expensive. So if we're going to actually follow through on the Creek Corridor plan, for example, we should put aside money to actually do that.
Thank you. Let's see. I've lost track here. Councilmember Goodman.
Thank you, Councilmember Goodman here. I'll be brief. I think that hazard pay is a good suggestion. I would interested in hearing more details on that. I'm sure that the administration will be very thoughtful when honing in on what that might look like and what it might cost. I am interested in and like the comments that I hear about looking at strategic plan and also other projects that we haven't been able to get to. The open space certainly is one, and I'm not opposing that at all. But I also think that we have done a lot in the open space area, and so while not opposing it, I'm only suggesting that I like the comments about looking at other things as well. The only thing I can think of, I'm not itching to spend it right now. And for one reason is that we have the Capital Finance Task Force that's working, and I just don't know what that group might come up with in terms of recommendations that might, I don't know because I don't know, but I'm thinking that there might be some things that that we could use that money for that would advance some of the things that we want to do. And that's not very articulate, but it is some, 1.5 million, 1.25 million that we might be able to spend to advance some of that group's recommendations. And I don't have any idea what they are because we've only met a couple times. Anyway, those are just my brief comments right now. Thanks.
Thank you. And Councilmember March, you're next.
Thank you, Councilmember DeMichelle. This is Councilmember Marks. I would very much, when this question comes back to us, I would very much like to see our options kind of in a Venn diagram. So you've got two circles that overlap, right? One is one-time investment fund possibilities, and the other is ARPA opportunities, right? And what I think we really want to think about is what are the things that are that you can spend money on from one-time investment, but you can't spend ARPA money on, right? And I think of those, one that's particularly interesting is Councilmember Hall's suggestion about debt service. And one of the reasons I think that's interesting is it actually would potentially expand the latitude of the capital financing task force, right? Because the economics of what we choose from council, if there were to be a solution that involved councilmatic bond authority or some other bond authority, you know, those numbers would change as a result of retiring some debt service. So that is definitely an element that I would like to have us discuss further down the road. But I'm also, I don't have a super clear vision about what things are in that part of the Venn diagram where you can do it with one-time investment fund, but you can't do it with ARPA. So whatever else is in that category, that's what I'm particularly interested in, given that the ARPA funds are so much larger than the one-time investment funds. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Martz. Are there any other comments? All right, seeing one, Councilmember Hall.
Thank you, Councilmember Hall. Just a quick question then. I don't know why I keep sneaking in at the last minute, Barb, sorry. But for administration, is this the kind of feedback you're looking for? Like, are you hoping for us to settle on a couple and then you come back with a proposal, or based on all of the different potential things that we're interested in funding or getting more information about funding, you're going to come back with your administration's recommendation? I guess what's really the next step?
Councilmember Hall, members of the council, I think what we'll try to do is review the notes from this discussion and try to come back with a recommendation at your meeting on the 26th, and we'll go from there.
Did you get your question answered? Great. Okay. Thank you. Any other comments? All right, I'll put in my 2 cents here too. So I certainly think that Councilmember Hall's idea about hazard pay has a lot of merit. We have relied on a core of employees that have really done outstanding work and been there with us the whole way. And I think it would be very, very appropriate to recognize that sacrifice that they gave to us. So I like that idea very much. I'm going to +1 the idea of open space. And I want to share with you, I read an article today in the New Yorker which analyzed what happened during the heat dome last summer, analyzed it as its impact on Portland, but also on Washington State. 96 people died in Portland and 95 in Washington State. And the analysis they did is that most of those who died were in areas with no tree canopy at all. So tree canopy is an important resiliency factor for communities going into climate change as it continues to affect us more and more. So the idea of taking the money and putting it into open space acquisition, I think is something that our community not only supports, but it would be something that will help us be a much more resilient community going into the future. So those would be my 2 priorities there. Are there any more comments before I summarize this discussion? All right, seeing none. Councilmember Hall?
Actually, thank you, Councilmember Michelle. I do have a quick question for you, just a process question.
Okay.
Are you summarizing feedback for the one-time investment fund feedback now, and then we'll go into ARPA? Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for the clarification. So I think we heard a lot of support for a possibility of providing hazard pay for employees. We heard 2 or 3 council members, I'm not quite sure exactly how many, who said that they'd like to hold on to the money or put it toward debt reduction or wait until later. Let's see. Heard from several council members who said they'd like to see how this relates to the strategic plan. And if there are areas in the strategic plan that we could move the dial on, they'd like to hear feedback from the administration on those. And then the request that we have a kind of Venn diagram showing the areas where we could have the one-time expenditures or ARPA opportunities, and how those two would relate to how we spend this money. So is there any corrections or additions to those comments? Councilmember or Council President Hunt.
Thank you. I had a question. You mentioned that several council members were interested in using the one-time funds for debt service, and I also did hear that, but I didn't actually hear, and I could very well have missed it, I didn't actually hear anybody who said they wanted to just hold on to the funds, although I did hear questions that people wanted answers to that we would then need to have for the next round of discussion, like the Venn diagram. But I just wanted to check on that because I didn't actually hear anybody who said they wanted to hang on to it.
Yeah, I heard Councilmember Goodman say that she wanted to hang on to
for
it.
the capital.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
I didn't just say hang on to it. I said that I mentioned the capital finance task force, and that I believe that task force is scheduled to meet through January, and that their recommendations could have some uses for that money that we haven't thought of. That was, yeah, that was the hang on to it part that but it wasn't just for hang on to it just because.
Right.
Thank you.
I will amend my notes. Thank you very much. Any other comments? All right, we had the last question, which dealt with, let's see how that was stated. Should the council approach ARPA through the budget? And Councilmember Walsh, did you want to clarify? I think you had some questions about how we approach this item. So if you'd like to go first, I will let you go first.
I would love to, but I think I just deleted my entire inbox, which was where I had the notes. So let me see if I can remember off the top of my head. But I think my kind of point was, hey, we've got some ARPA funds obviously coming in to the city, and I'd like to be able to provide transparency to the public about what we can use those ARPA funds for, or the sense of we just don't know yet. And then also this concept similar to our fiscal policy, which says, you know, we shouldn't hold on to taxpayer money beyond a reasonable amount that we've determined is the 15 to 20%. We should spend that because we get taxpayer money in order to provide services and feedback to the community. Similarly, I'd like to be able to explain to the community why we are or are not spending that money at this time, if there is a reason to hold on to that. And then a timeline for when we plan to look at this money. If I'm looking back in kind of the first time we talked about ARPA funds, I believe we said that we wanted to consider any one-time urgent needs, but otherwise we should take our time, be consistent and strategic with how we spend the money, and potentially hold off and spend it in the 2022 budget. Well, here we are in the 2022 budget, so I want to be able to provide that full circle information and understand from the other council members whether we feel an urgency in spending this money or whether we're still feeling strategic and like we have the time to spend it, and if so, what that timeline is, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Council President Hunt, did you have a question that I missed? Or was that earlier?
Earlier.
Oh, earlier. Okay. Councilmember Hall.
Thank you, Councilmember Hall here. My only feedback for the ARPA section would be to piggyback off what we heard already from Council Members Goodman and Martz. The Capital Finance Community Task Force is actively engaged in conversations about potential funding sources and the whole spectrum of funding sources for our capital needs in the city. And ARPA has been a topic of discussion several times on our last meeting when we talked about public financing. So I guess my main feedback for ARPA funding would be I would suggest that we try to remain conservative with what we spend in that fund and keep that as a lever that can be used when the Capital Finance Community Task Force is making recommendations at the beginning of next year.
Okay. Anybody else? City Administrator Bob Quitz.
Thank you, Councilmember DiMichele. If I could ask the city clerk to put the slide back up on this topic. I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page as to where the administration is going with this based on the feedback.
Give me just a moment here.
If easier, I can also share.
That'd be great, Susie.
Okay, I wasn't sure who had it handy. We go the slide with the ARPA information. I think it's the next slide, or there we go. So the amount that we've been allocated is a little over $11 million. We have received half of that money, again, through the state of Washington. Given the size of the community that we are not receiving the money directly from the federal government. It's being passed through the state of Washington. As has been discussed, we have tried to focus on urgent needs, and certainly this is not the only money that the city has spent on urgent needs. You will recall we started in 2020 before there was a CARES Act with general fund dollars, then there were CARES Act dollars, there was additional general fund dollars, and so we have made some significant investments. But again, I think in Mayor Pauly's direction, Benton Kobelisk was tasked from our economic development staff to look at other urgent needs. He has come before the council one other time. He's coming back next week on the 18th at the council meeting to talk a little bit more about what we see are remaining urgent needs. And so we will be coming to the council next week with proposal for expenditures of about $600,000 for a state of Washington run small business flex fund. And then also Monica Negrilla from our human services staff will come with a proposal on additional rental assistance. The work that Monica and Benton have done, there is a funding gap that we've identified that's not being covered by other levels of government in their rental assistance. So we'd like to talk about that with the council. The other piece of the sort of immediate funding that we talked about at the council in the springtime was those other Issaquah government agencies that have performed essential work through the pandemic but have not received ARPA fundings. And there's really two of those. One is Eastside Fire and Rescue, and the other is the Sammamish Plateau Water Agency. So we would like to talk with the council about opportunities to fund there. What we've learned in the months since the discussions in the springtime is that the rules and regulations from the United States Treasury Department continue to evolve. And while there have been other communities that have come up with full plans for spending, we have discovered in talking with many of them that they're still trying to take the plans and match them with the regulations. And I think some communities are quite honestly struggling a little bit from those early plans. There's also differences in those cities that receive funding directly from the federal government versus those cities that are receiving funding through their states. So that has been part of our challenge in looking at how that money can be spent. But on the 18th next week, we want to try to bring to a conclusion the business assistance, the rental assistance, and certainly have an additional discussion regarding the government agencies. We've talked pretty extensively with EFER about what funds we may be able to provide, and again, looking to see what the federal government's rules will allow for us to do. And we honestly may not have that resolved for you by the 18th, but we would like at least to get the council's concurrence that that's something we want to do. Sammamish Plateau Water District, we've only had the most preliminary of discussions with them, and quite honestly probably won't be ready to conclude those in time for the council's October 18th meeting. So then that leaves the balance of the money. We have $1.25 million included in this year's capital budget to be spent, and the remaining dollars really are unallocated. And I think as has been discussed tonight, there's the capital financing task force that is working. There is just the community dialogue of what would these Build Back Better kind of projects look like. And since we have some time before the federal government is requiring this money to be spent, it's our plan to come back to the council at the first of the year in 2022 to start narrowing down what some of those Build Back Better projects may be. The Capital Financing Task Force will be back to the council in the January-February timeframe with their recommendations. So our hope, certainly from the administration standpoint, Mayor Pauly's standpoint, is that by springtime of 2022, we'll be well on our way with a process to identify the spending of the balance of these funds. So hopefully, Councilmember Walsh, members of the council, who I hope that gives a broader perspective of certainly where the administration sees that we're at. Clearly, 6 months ago, we thought that this would be a faster process, and it really has been slowed down largely because the federal government is sending mixed messages and complete messages. And we're very concerned that we do not want to advise the council to allocate funds and ultimately have those funds not be eligible for ARPA dollars. It's taken much longer than we've thought. We actually have decided to contract with some outside financial consultants for a small amount of money, about $20,000, to help us sort through this. Other communities are doing this just to make sure that we're documenting everything properly, that as we're making money available to other organizations, that the agreements granting that money are consistent with both state requirements and federal requirements. It's just taken a lot longer. But again, I want to compliment Benton, and you'll hear more from him next week. Really with the council and the mayor's initial direction was go out and find out what are those urgent needs. And I feel very comfortable that we have gone out and reached out to folks. So I think we'll be ending 2021 knowing that we've made good investments, that the money's been well spent, and then as we look at 22, we can make some larger commitments for the balance of those dollars. Mm-hmm. So Councilmember DiMichele, thank you for giving me a few minutes just to kind of amplify a little bit on where we're at. We have not talked about this in any great detail in a while, and certainly we want to use the budget process to certainly not bring this to a closure, but make sure everyone's up to date and we're all in agreement where we are and what the next steps are.
City Administrator Bob Woods, could you just remind me, when do the funds, ARPA funds, need to be spent? By what time?
And I will ask Autumn, who I asked to double check that date for me.
Sure. So the funds must be obligated by the end of 2024 and expended by the end of 2026. And I just put in there a comment too, just to add on to Administrator Bobkowitz's kind of description of taking longer than we first expected. Another thing that just happened a week ago is that Treasury extended the deadline for us, even in reporting, until next spring, until April. And so the timeline has slowed very much. And so we don't even know all the details for what's needed for reporting yet. And that's been pushed out. So this process is taking longer than we expected. We've also reached out to several of our, what we're calling sister cities, in the sense of cities of our size who are receiving similar amounts of ARPA funding. And they're all in the same boat as us right now, as far as, you know, addressing some immediate needs, but also taking a bit more time when it comes to the larger picture and figuring out what to do with the balance of ARPA funds.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Council President Hunt, I believe, is next. Or no, I'm sorry, Councilmember Walsh and then Council President Hunt.
Thank you. This is Councilmember Walsh. City Administrator Bobkowitz, I very much appreciate coming on and talking about the timeline and looking toward spring of 2022 and how the requirements have obviously changed or, you know, not been clarified, and that leading to an extension. So appreciate that. Thank you.
And Council President Hunt.
Thank you. This is Council President Hunt. I agree with Councilmember Walsh. I think given some of that uncertainty, and also just I think given the need for conversation with the community and needing to narrow down all the possibilities and really understand what would be the most transformative and build back better projects that we could do, I think that will take some time. So we should take the time to do that. I am generally in support of that. As far as the shorter term or the October 18th, which we'll have another discussion about, when I was thinking of urgent needs, definitely things like rental assistance, preventing people from being evicted where they're not, receiving funds from other agencies. We've, I think, established that there is a need that is unmet in that area. So definitely that, I think, falls into that urgent category for me, as well as the other government agencies that are performing essential work that were not eligible for the ARPA funds. I think we should be very careful and very selective beyond that, because I think it's very important that we do have a clear vision for and come to a clear plan about what we would do with the remainder of this funding, because it really is, I think, a once in a lifetime opportunity to invest in the community. And so I would not want to make decisions that sort of erode our ability to use the balance of this fund for a really transformative project. Thank you.
And Autumn, it says comment in the chat. Did you want to add anything?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay. Are there any more comments on this last item? I have a few notes here, but it sounds as though there's a general agreement that we want to be careful about how we spend or allocate these funds. We'd like there to be a transparent process and explanations to the community about why or why not we are spending, and just a very deliberate and careful, selective process. And does anybody want to add to that summary? All right, thank you very, very much. Our next item is good of the order, and I believe we have at least one. Lindsay? Oh, City Administrator Bobkowitz, did you want to add something?
Yes, Councilmember DiMichele, members of the council. Before we leave the item, Susie, if we could put up the next step slide. Just want to make sure that we're all on the same page moving forward. as time is passing, as we've got a study session coming up on the 26th. These are the topics that we have identified. We have no other topics that we are planning to cover. You got extensive answers to questions in the packet this evening. We have not covered all of those. Certainly the police and human services questions were significant. That's why we led with them, but there were other questions that were asked and answered, some of which are on the 26, others we're just leaving for the council's information. So I would ask the question this evening that if we go through the topics listed on the 26th, we would come back and talk further about the 1.25 million, the hazard pay, as it pertains to that or doesn't pertain to that, I guess would be another topic. But if we cover those topics listed plus those I've just mentioned, will we be done? And are there other topics that the council wishes to discuss prior to final consideration of the proposed budget?
Council President Hunt, I did also have a comment from Councilmember Walsh. Do you want to wait, Councilmember Walsh? Okay, Councilmember Hunt?
Thank you. This is in response to the city administrator's question. So I think that this is a complete list, except that we did have a number of questions regarding the one-time, the 1.25 million one-time fund. And so I think for that one, that probably needs to come back with that additional information that was requested by council for another discussion, which would probably be at this date.
Yes, and our plan then would be to add that to this list for the 26th.
Yeah. Any other comments? All right, I'm going to go back to Councilmember Walsh.
Thank you. This is Councilmember Walsh. I know we put our thumbs up for the police department staffing and the human services roles and staffing, but there's so much more to that. And I just really wanted to thank the administration and both of those teams for very thoughtful approaches to staffing. On the police department, I very much appreciate taking a look at our current organizational chart and recognizing that we could do with some additional managers, and that providing opportunities to current employees to look at these other teams is fantastic. It also provides great services to our community when it comes to the community resource officer and their relationship to the human services roles, when it comes to traffic and special enforcement. So I think this is just a very well thought out approach to how we look at staffing for public safety. And then I am so very grateful to look at bringing the human services coordinator role in-house and having that internal and the ability to increase service levels. I think both of these are just very well thought out opportunities to serve our communities. And I didn't want to let it pass to just put a thumbs up on that without making some comments on how much I appreciate the thoughtful nature of this. So thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other comments before we go to good of the order? Councilmember Goodman.
That was just my thumbs up to Councilmember Walsh's comments about appreciating the thoughtful provisions in the budget for those two departments. Thanks.
Thank you. Any other comments? All right, thank you, everyone. And I plus one Councilmember Walsh's comments as well. So good of the order. Do we have any good of the order? Council President Hunt?
Thank you. Just very briefly, there was an email that went out regarding SCA appointments. Several of us serve on SCA appointed committees, and they're requesting that we let them know which positions we would like to continue in or apply for new positions. So if you, several of you have already let me and the mayor know which positions you are interested in. And if you haven't, if you could please let us know before Monday of next week, that would be excellent. So we can start planning for that application process. Thank you.
Thanks. Councilmember Walsh.
Thank you. Toward that idea, is anybody currently on one of the serving on the SEA roles not reapplying, so that those of us who are looking at where they might fit in regionally understand what possibilities?
Yeah, if it's okay, this is Councilmember Hall. Real quick, I serve as an SCA alternate for the King County Affordable Housing Committee, and I'm trying to. It's been a pleasure. I've loved the learning, and it really great connecting with other people in the affordable housing space. But I'm trying to trim down my extracurriculars at the moment. So I will be requesting that I am removed from that one for next year. So if there's any interest from other council members for that one, it's a good one.
Great. Any other good of the order? All right. Thank you, everybody. We will be holding a special council meeting immediately following this meeting to convene into executive session. We will use the same meeting link, so council members, please stay on this meeting. I'd like to take a little poll of whether council members would like to take a 5-minute break at this point. Any thumbs up? I see thumbs up. All right, we will take a 5-minute break. And so there being no further business, the study session is adjourned and the special meeting will convene at 9 p.m. Thank you.